Thanks, thank you, thanks. Yeah, welcome back everyone. And thank you, Richard, for the nice introduction. So, does this work? Can everybody hear me? Yeah, great. So, it's really great to be here. Thanks to Richard for this invitation. I'm really happy to be here. And this is really a beautiful venue, and you have a fantastic community here. So, yeah, I'm really happy to be able to present our research here. So before I start, I also want to acknowledge my co-authors here, because this is not just my work. This is the effort of a big team from my colleagues at EPFL in Switzerland and also Trinity College in the US. So before I start with the actual topic, a few words about who am I? So I'm a postdoc at EPFL since 2015. Before, I did my PhD in cryptography in Germany, and my research interests are generally applied cryptography, decentralized systems, and information security. And I've been working on many different projects, from symmetric cryptography over applied cryptography in decentralized systems to analysis of the security in smart grids, or also on the analysis of the security in TLS, for example. I'm also a member of the Initiative for Cryptocurrencies and Contracts, which was initiated by Cornell Tech in the USA. I'm a member of the Chaos Computer Club in Germany, the CCC. And I'm also the scientific advisor for the Definity project. And you can also find me on Twitter under the handle Dinar. All right, so here is the talk outline. First of all, I will motivate the problem. Then I will introduce the OmniLedger project. I will show you the evaluation that we did in our lab. And then finally, I will conclude my talk. All right, so coming to the motivation, I guess many of you know the Nakamoto consensus that underlies the Bitcoin blockchain. And the Nakamoto consensus has several drawbacks, as it turned out over time. So as many of you might know, is that the transaction confirmation delay is very long. It takes at least 10 minutes, because that's the time for a new block to be mined, right? So before a transaction can be confirmed, it has to go into a Bitcoin block. But 10 minutes is often not enough, right? You have to wait multiple blocks before you can be sure that the transaction is actually confirmed. Because at the tip of the blockchain, forks can happen, because two miners at different points in the network might find different blocks simultaneously, and then you have a temporary fork. So this is a property which is also known as weak consistency. And this weak consistency only if your transaction is buried, like, let's say 6 blocks in the blockchain. So after 1 hour, roughly 1 hour, you can be very sure that your transaction is really confirmed, so that there no more forks can happen at that point. Then also, Bitcoin has a very low throughput. We all know the discussion that has been going on for quite some time on really how to get more performance out of the Bitcoin blockchain. And currently, it is still at 7 transactions per second. Although there are endeavors to increase the blockchain, the throughput of the Bitcoin blockchain, currently we're still operating at 7 transactions per second. And then also, I probably don't have to mention that the proof of work mining wastes a huge amount of energy, right? So we have these big ASIC farms which burn tons of coal and which produce tons of CO2, which is very bad for the environment. So scaling blockchains is really an important problem that we need to tackle. And if you are not convinced by now, but if you have followed the news recently, then you've seen that scaling blockchains is more important than ever because people want to buy crypto kitties on the blockchain, right? And so we've seen on the Ethereum blockchain that people started to trade these digital crypto kitties, and it was basically, slowing down the Ethereum network drastically because these smart contracts that run this game on the Ethereum blockchain, they are currently producing 15% of the network traffic in Ethereum. All right. So, but scaling blockchains is not easy at all. So you cannot just go in and simply scale the Bitcoin blockchain. So many people have attempted to do that, and now I wanted to have a look on the different ways that people attempted to scale blockchains. So we have here a triangle with 3 different dimensions. On the left-hand side we have scale out, on the top we have decentralization, and on the right here we have security. And the first project that I wanted to mention is the Elastico Project, which was presented by researchers in 2016, last year, by Liu et al. And the corresponding paper appeared in CCS, and it's called a secure sharding protocol for open blockchains. Okay, but when you look at that protocol, then you realize that it's not actually secure. So Elastico wants to use sharding to scale out, and it's doing so by leveraging the proof of work, by looking at the least significant bit of the proof of work, and then it's assigning the validators to the different shards, and through that you get scale out performance. But the problem is that this approach is not bias resistant. Miners can just drop blocks, and by that they can bias the distribution of the validators to the shards. And when you run the numbers, then you see that actually Elastico has a very high probability of failure. So if you just run 16 shards with validators, so you have basically 16 parallel blockchains to process your transactions, then the failure probability is over 95%, so which is very high. Elastico, they did not manage to get down on the high confirmation latency because they are still using proof of work. And they also do not have an atomic cross-shard protocol. Consider you have like these 16 shards and you have your bank accounts or your addresses registered in 2 different shards. Then you want to be able to pay from one shard to the other, right? And for that you need an atomic commit protocol to be able to send transactions from one shard to the other. Otherwise it might happen that your transactions hang forever and your funds get lost. The other project that I wanted to mention is RSCoin, which also appeared in 2016 in the paper Centrally Banked Cryptocurrencies. And it's on the lower end of this dimension, so it manages to scale out and it is actually secure, but it does so at the cost of decentralization because it assumes to have a trusted third party in the form, for example, of a bank, which does the auditing and which is responsible for the shard creation. It also has no Byzantine fault tolerance protocol, but just a much simpler, a much simpler two-phase commit protocol. So you also have to trust the client, so the people who are sent transactions in this in RSCoin, because when they could theoretically collude together with the validators and mount through that double spending attacks. So that's also something that we want to avoid. And in general, we are more interested in decentralized systems because, as Nick Szabo said, trusted third parties are basically security holes, right? And we want to avoid security holes. Another project is Biscoin, which was one of our prior works in 2016. It also appeared as Usenix security. And Biscoin is on the decentralization and security axis. So Biscoin scales already very well, but only up to a certain point. Because in Biscoin, we do not allow sharding, so we do not have like these, for example, parallel blockchains. We just have one single blockchain. And you can only handle in your consensus group a certain number of validators. After a certain threshold, your system will not scale anymore. So, and that's why this scale out property is so important. Okay, and what I want to present in this work is OmniLedger, which actually achieves all three of those properties. All right. So in OmniLedger, when we started working on that, we set us several design goals. The first three are security goals. First of all, as I mentioned, we wanted to achieve full decentralization. This means no trusted third parties or single point of failures. The second goal is shard robustness. We want to allow that, since we are interested in the permissionless model, we want to allow that validators are able to join and leave the shards at any time as they wish, and without that the shard falls apart. So the shard should still be able to process transactions securely and continuously. And the third is that we also, of course, want to get secure transactions. So since we are aiming for a sharded ledger, we want to be able to that the transactions commit atomically or abort eventually. That's the property that I already mentioned before, where Elastico, for example, fails. And we also had three performance goals, namely we wanted to achieve scale-out performance. That means that the throughput increases linearly in the number of validators, meaning the more hardware I add to the system, the throughput goes linearly up with the added hardware. We also want to achieve low storage so that the validators do not need to store the entire shard transaction history. So they only have to store certain checkpoints in the shard to be able to process the transactions. And we also want to get away from this high transaction confirmation latency. So when a client sends a transaction, we want to have a confirmation within a few seconds. So OmniLedger, okay, something broke here. That's the overview of OmniLedger. We have here three distinct phases that I want to go through in the next few moments. So what you see here is, for example, the OmniLedger network, and the nodes here, these are the validators who run the consensus mechanism, and the different colors symbolize the different shards in the network. So for example, here we have three shards. We have the green shard, we have a blue shard, and we have an orange shard. And then we have like some gray nodes here which do not yet participate in the consensus mechanism. So, and since new validators are joining and leaving, that's what we want to allow, because we are interested in the permissionless model. When the whole system works in epochs, so when we then switch from one epoch to the next, we use a mechanism where you can generate distributed randomness in a secure way to assign some of the validators that are active to new shards. And by that, we allow that the validators join and leave their shards. So for example, here, as you can see, This guy down here, he is becoming assigned to the green shard in epoch E. And some other people here, for example, this guy, he became inactive because he's not participating anymore for whatever reason. And then, so this is how the validator assignment works. And then, as I already mentioned, every shard has its own blockchain basically, and they run a consensus protocol to process the transactions and extend the corresponding shard. And then we have clients which send transactions from one shard to the other. And we have a special protocol that ensures this atomic commit that I already mentioned before. Okay, let's have a closer look at the 3 steps. So the sharding works in 3 steps again. So first of all, we have so the sharding is always run across all validators that exist, across all shards. And then we temporarily elect one of them as a leader, just through a decentralized lottery, essentially, which uses a cryptographic construction which is called a verifiable random function. And once this leader is elected, this leader initiates another randomness protocol that we also designed a while ago, which is called the Randhound protocol, where all validators in the system, they come together, run this protocol, and then they collectively generate a random string that is verifiable by third parties. And then with this verifiable randomness, they basically generate the shard assignment that I mentioned in the last slide. So the goal of this is to prevent an adaptive adversary from subverting an entire shard with high probability, right? So that's also the reason why we, from time to time, assign the validators to new shards, so that the adversary never is like the shard assignment is a constant moving target for the adversary. The consensus mechanism uses the goal of the consensus mechanism is, of course, to ensure the shard consistency to process the transactions and to extend the blockchain. And we use a protocol which is called BisCoinX, which we came up for this project, which is basically an extension of our previous Bitcoin protocol adapted to this use case. And what we use here is so Bitcoin is targeted at very high scale for very high scale consensus process operation, but we found out that you can reduce that high scalability a little bit for that use case and go to group instead of a tree-based communication, which is totally fine for this particular scenario, and we found out that it actually performs better in practical scenarios and in those relevant configurations. And then also, I don't want to go too much into the details. The blockchain in the shard chains in OmniLedger, they are actually block DAGs instead of blockchains, and they capture better the dependencies between the different transactions. And this allows us to do better performance. This allows us to achieve better performance due to better resource utilization. Okay, so another very important protocol that I mentioned before is the one for transaction commitment, and this is called the Atomics protocol, with the goal to manage secure cross-shard transactions. So cross-shard transactions commit atomically or they abort eventually, and how this works is depicted over here on the right-hand side. So when a client wants to send so let's consider a client has 2 addresses or 2 bank accounts in the blue shard and in the green shard, and he wants to send a transaction to the yellow shard. So what he does is then he's forming this transaction which has inputs in shard 1 and shard 2, so the blue and the green, and has an output in the yellow shard, shard 3. And then he's sending this transaction to the blue and green shards, And the validators take this and verify the transaction to see if they can if he can actually spend his funds, if he has enough money in his account. If so, then we are up here and the validators lock the funds and they send back an acceptance proof to the client, and then the client can take he's collecting all the acceptance proofs from all the shards and goes then to the output shard to tell them, hey, look, all the input shards confirm that I can spend my funds, and now you get here the credits. And if one of the shards in the lower part, if one of the shards rejects the locking because, for example, the client does not have enough funds, then he's getting here a rejection proof, and then the client can use this rejection proof to reclaim the transaction inputs from other shards where the funds were already locked. Okay. So finally, another very important concept that we developed for OmniLedger is a trust but verify transaction validation, with the goal to avoid the latency versus throughput trade-off. So usually you can have, in common cryptocurrencies, you can have either big blocks with a very high throughput, but then you have also a very high latency, or you have small blocks with also a small throughput then, but your transaction validation is very fast. So, and by moving to a two-step validation process, you can actually work around that issue. Namely, you have some of your validators, they form what we call optimistic validators, and a client, he's first sending his transaction to these optimistic validators, and then they check the transaction and they say, okay, we can immediately confirm that the transaction is good, and the client can go its way and present the proof to, for example, the web shop or whatever. And then, but these optimistic validators, they collect these transactions and they send these optimistically validated block to a set of core validators who actually then ensure who have a much higher security margin because they are just much more. Because for an adversary, it's of course much easier to corrupt one of these smaller shards here, than the big one over there. So the core validators then do a revalidation of these optimistically validated blocks, and once if everything is correct, the finalized block goes into the blockchain. So, for example, the optimistically validated blocks can be of the order of 500 kilobytes, whereas then the high throughput is achieved through these finalized blocks. They are 16 megabyte blocks. So we also evaluated OmniLedger in our lab environment. The system is implemented in Golang. And we also implemented all the sub-protocols like the Bitcoin X consensus protocol or this atomic commit protocol. And we also used our already existing code libraries. So we have a crypto library called Kyber, we have a networking library, and we have the Authority framework, which is the framework that where all the protocols are implemented. And you can find all of the code here. And then we evaluated OmniLedger on 48 physical machines, and we did some multiplexing of the processes on top of all the machines. And we also simulated, we put some network restrictions to simulate a real-world deployment. So, for example, we reduced the bandwidth to 20 megabits per second, and we imposed a 20 millisecond round-trip latency. So first, we looked at the throughput that we can achieve with OmniLedger. And here on the right-hand side, what you can see on the x-axis is on the one hand the shard size, and on the other hand the adversarial power. And here on the y-axis, you can see the transactions per second. And we also added here the line, the average throughput that Visa is doing, which is around 4,000 transactions. And as you can see, depending on the adversarial power, so the further right the bars, the higher the adversarial power. But you can see already for a shard size of 70 and an adversary of 12.5%, we get easily above the transaction throughput that Visa is doing. And also what you can see here is the differences between an OmniLedger where you have just like regular shards and the trust but verify shards for the quick validation that adds also to which is also beneficial for the throughput of the system. And also what you can see is, since one of our goals, if you remember, for performance was that we achieve scale-out performance of OmniLedger. And here, again, for this shard size of 70 and 12.5% adversarial power, with an increasing number of shards, so one shard achieves then 440 transactions per second. For example, when you move to 2 shards, it's already at 800. For 4 shards, it's at 1600. For 8 shards, it's at 3,200 transactions per second. So you can really see that this is a linear increase in the transaction throughput. We also evaluated the confirmation latency, how it is perceived from a client who is sending transactions to the OmniLedger system. And for example, when you just take a regular validation, and for a shard size of 600 nodes and 25% adversary, then we achieve roughly with 1 megabyte blocks 14 seconds transaction confirmation. So that's like very far away from what Bitcoin is currently doing with at least 10 minutes, but between 10 minutes and 1 hour. So here we have 14 seconds. And when you move to this 2-step validation process, then the optimistic validation is after 4 seconds, whereas the second level validation is after roughly 1 minute. And of course, yeah, this latency increase is due to the optimistically blocks are batched into larger blocks for the final validation to achieve a better throughput. That's also, as I mentioned, the first level blocks are just 500 kilobytes, so you can verify and validate them very quickly and confirm them very quickly, whereas the second level validation blocks that go into the blockchain are 16 megabytes to get a good throughput. All right, so that brings me to the end of my talk. So what I presented you is OmniLedger, which is a secure scale-out distributed ledger framework, and you can use it for proof of work, proof of stake in a permission setting or in any other Sybil-resistant identity establishing mechanism that you can come up with. It does sharding through publicly verifiable randomness, in particular the Randhound protocol that we developed. It does intra-shard BFT consensus using the BisCoinX protocol. There is a secure cross-sharding transaction protocol that we call Atomics. We also were able to show that you can actually avoid the latency versus high throughput trade-off via this 2-step transaction validation process, the trust but verify transaction validation. And our evaluation was also able to show that OmniLedger is able to achieve Visa level throughput and beyond. So if you want to see the technical details, then I encourage you to look at our research paper that you can see under that address here. And if you are interested also in the code, then everything is open source on GitHub. So that's it from my side. Thank you for your attention, and now I'm happy to take your questions. All right, let's try this. Oh.
Hello, hello. Thank you very much for the fantastic presentation there. But my question is more on the very first bullet you have there as far as the mining potentials within your system. How is it possible that you can have a proof of work and proof of stake and other options for the miners on the same chain? And also, what is your future perspective on the different options and what's more applicable for advancing the systems?
So in OmniLedger, we are not using the mining to process transactions as it is in Bitcoin. We exclusively use mining to establish the identities of the validators. So, and for that, you can use either proof of work, proof of stake, or you can also go to a permission system. And you even could imagine that different shards have different mechanisms to allow the validators to establish their identities, and then they run within the shard this consensus mechanism, this Bitcoin X that I mentioned, but you do not need proof of work or proof of stake or anything like that for the actual consensus mechanism. That's just really exclusively necessary for establishing the identities. How a mix of like proof of work, proof of stake, or permissioned would look like, that's still an open research question.
Okay, but more specifically, what is the incentive for the actual miners themselves to work within this framework?
So we looked at this completely not from an incentive perspective. That's like on top of this again. So you could also imagine that the miners are incentivized to run the consensus, and they get transaction fees, or so for example, through transaction fees, you could incentivize the miners to uphold the system. Or in a permission setting, you don't even usually need you usually don't even need an incentive mechanism, because the validators, they are established, for example, by banks, and they have, of course, their interest to run this ledger, right?
That's one potential feature.
Okay.
Thanks for your talk. I got a question about this optimistic validation.
Yes.
How much certainty or how much security are you sacrificing in order to get faster confirmations? I mean, isn't this like, in a sense, still zero confirmation acceptance?
So thanks, that's a good question. So let me just quickly go back to answer that.
You mentioned the web shop that could already accept the payments based upon the validation from the optimistic validator.
Yeah.
But how certain or uncertain is this?
So the thing is that the node here, when they are confirming a transaction and but they are actually cheating, so what they have to do to confirm the transaction, they of course have to sign the transaction, and this works as a proof so if they then cheat, then the client can go and say, hey, but you validated my transaction, and then they could go to the rest of the system and they could get punished, right? So you could. Well, you could think about that. For example, then the validators, when you think that they run through proof of stake, that then some of the money from their stake is subtracted, right? So you could somehow, and you could through that you could refund the client that got cheated on.
You mean the merchant?
Or the merchant, yes,
but
or both.
Doesn't this leave an opportunity for malicious customers to like double spend, to perform a double spend on two different merchants? If they manage to run the same transaction through two different optimistical validators? Yeah.
So, but again, they can do that, but they cannot. This is like then within a few seconds. I mean, the clients, they can do that, and but then within a few seconds, I mean, the core validators are sitting here, and they are revalidating all the transactions that go through the system, and they will catch the double spending, and then they will punish the client.
Okay, but sure. So, but to get absolute certainty, you still have to wait for the core validators.
Yes, that's true.
Okay.
That is true.
Right.
That is true.
Yeah.
More questions? I don't know. Okay.
What's the next step? When is this going to be implemented?
Okay, so the question was, what's the next step? When is this going to be implemented? So,
When is your ICO?
when is our ICO? Yeah, good question. So it is already implemented, but it's of course a research prototype. So we have it running in our research environment. We are thinking about bringing that to production, but I cannot say exactly when this will happen or in which model this will happen. So these are still open questions. If you have suggestions, I am open to that. Also to ICO suggestions if you wish. Okay, more questions?
So, thank you for the talk. Does it mean that the distribution of transactions and everything is centrally managed with this approach?
What? No, it's not centrally managed.
How do you distribute it to the shards if that's not the case?
So yes, no, they are not centrally managed because the miners, they can still come and go as they wish. They are just assigned periodically to some of these shards to say, okay, you are now a red miner and you take care of the consistency in that shard for, let's say, a day or something like that, and then you are getting reassigned to another shard, and then you move from time to time, you're reassigned from one shard to the next. And if you want to leave, then you're free to do so.
Yeah, but that process is a centralization, no?
Why is that centralization? You can...
It's algorithmically determined, right? Everybody can do it like...
No. So it's... what we use here is a way how you... So we have a protocol that generates this assignment in a random way, and everybody contributes to the generation of the randomness. So every full node that is in the system contributes to this randomness. So consider this like as in Bitcoin. What Bitcoin is doing continuously is running a decentralized lottery. And we came up with a protocol that simulates this decentralized lottery, but without proof of work. Right? So we have a protocol that generates the randomness, and from this randomness we do the assignment to the shards. But there is no centralization in this system here. We just batch the validators and assign them to certain shards so that they can more efficiently process the transactions within a shard. That's the only thing that we do here. More questions? I don't want to, I'm already too long up here, upstage. So if you have further questions, I'm around all evening, and I think it's time for the next speaker. Thanks again.